It started with a sharp crack of thunder. The storm rolled in fast that evening, unannounced and unforgiving, as if the sky itself was trying to send a message. Beneath its brooding clouds, a man stood alone on the edge of a desolate field. His face was worn, his shoulders slumped under the weight of too many regrets and too little hope. Life had not been kind to him, but then again, he hadn't been particularly kind to himself either. Once full of ambition and drive, he was now hollowed out, like an old tree whose roots had rotted away. The field he stood in was silent but for the wind, bending the tall grass into waves that seemed to mock his stillness. His boots sunk slightly into the damp earth as he stared out into the horizon, the storm clouds swallowing the last streaks of daylight. It wasn't just the weather that had brought him here tonight, it was something heavier, something that had gnawed at him for months. He had reached the kind of breaking point most people fear but never fully understand until they're standing on the edge of it. Just a year ago, his life looked entirely different. There had been a home, a family, a purpose. But piece by piece, it had all unraveled. He'd made mistakes, and they had cost him dearly, relationships broken beyond repair, a career that once seemed unstoppable now reduced to whispers of what could have been. Every door he tried to open slammed shut in his face, and eventually, he stopped trying. The world, it seemed, had turned its back on him, and so he turned his back on the world. The only thing left was this small, decaying ranch he had inherited from his late uncle. It wasn't much, a scattering of weather-beaten fences, an old barn that groaned in the wind, and a pasture overrun with weeds. He hadn't wanted it, not really, but it was the only place he had left to go when the rest of his life had crumbled to dust. At first, he thought it might offer some kind of escape, a chance to disappear. But the solitude here wasn't comforting, it was suffocating. The silence pressed down on him until he thought he might scream just to break it. That night, as the storm grew closer, he turned back toward the barn. Its faded red paint was peeling, the roof sagging under years of neglect. He hadn't been inside since he arrived, not really. It was easier to ignore it, to avoid confronting the ghosts of his uncle's life and, by extension, his own failures. But something about the storm made him pause. Perhaps it was the way the wind rattled the barn doors, daring him to open them. Or maybe it was the restless feeling gnawing at his chest, a sense that something was waiting for him on the other side. When he finally pushed open the heavy doors, the smell hit him first earthy and raw, mixed with the metallic tang of old tools and damp wood. Inside, shadows stretched long and uneven across the dirt floor, cast by the dim glow of a single hanging bulb. And then he saw it, a figure standing quietly in one of the far stalls. It was a horse, though at first glance, it looked more like a ghost. Its coat was dull and matted, patches of mud clinging stubbornly to its flanks. Its mane hung in tangled strands, and its ribs were visible beneath its skin, sharp and unforgiving. The horse lifted its head slightly as he entered, its dark eyes locking onto his. For a moment, neither of them moved. It was as if time itself had paused, holding its breath. He had no idea the horse was there. His uncle must have left it behind, a forgotten remnant of a life that no longer existed. Guilt crept into his chest as he realized how long the animal must have been alone, surviving on what little hay and rainwater it could find. And yet, there was something in the horse's gaze, something that stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't fear or anger or desperation. It was quiet, steady, and unflinching, like it was looking straight through him, past the walls he'd built around himself. The man had never been good with animals. He had never really tried to be. But something about this horse, standing there in the dim light, stirred something inside him he couldn't quite name. He didn't approach it right away. Instead, he stood there, gripping the edge of the door, unsure of what to do. The horse didn't move either, as if waiting for him to make the first move. As the storm outside reached its peak, the barn seemed to shrink around them, the walls groaning under the weight of the wind. The man took a hesitant step forward, his boots crunching against the dirt floor. The horse's ears flicked back slightly, but it didn't retreat. Another step, and then another, until he was close enough to see the flecks of dirt caught in its mane, the scars crisscrossing its legs. He raised a hand slowly, unsure if it would tolerate his touch. But before he could get any closer, the horse let out a sharp snort and stepped back, its hooves scraping against the ground. The man froze, his hand hovering in the air. For a moment, he thought about walking away, about leaving the barn and forgetting this encounter ever happened. But something inside him wouldn't let him. He didn't know it yet, but that horse, broken, abandoned, and scarred, was about to teach him something he'd never forget. Something that would force him to confront the ghosts of his past, to face the darkness he'd been running from for so long. It wasn't just about saving the horse, it was about saving himself. And as the first drops of rain began to patter against the barn roof, he had no idea just how much his life was about to change. The rain drummed against the barn roof with a relentless rhythm, a steady reminder of the storm outside. Inside, the air felt heavier now, thick with the damp smell of earth and the faint musk of the horse. The man stood frozen, his hands still hovering midair, unsure whether to move closer or step back. The horse's dark eyes stayed locked on him, wary but curious, as though it, too, was trying to decide if he was friend or foe. He dropped his hand slowly, letting it fall to his side, and took a small step back. The horse didn't move this time. It just watched him, its ears flicking slightly in the dim light. He sighed, running a hand over his face, and leaned against the wooden post of the stall. What was he even doing here? He didn't know the first thing about taking care of a horse. He'd barely been able to take care of himself these past few months. But leaving the animal in this state alone and neglected wasn't something he could stomach. The storm raged on as he stood there, staring at the horse and feeling the weight of his own inadequacy pressing down on him. He thought about his uncle, the man who had left him this ranch. They hadn't been particularly close, not in the way families are supposed to be. His uncle was a quiet man, rough around the edges but kind in his own way. He'd always been more comfortable around animals than people, spending his days tending to the few horses he owned and the land that stretched out endlessly around the ranch. When the man was a boy, his parents would bring him here during the summers, dropping him off for weeks at a time while they worked. He'd hated it back then, resenting the isolation and the endless chores his uncle made him do. But there had been moments fleeting, almost forgotten, when he'd felt something he couldn't quite name. A sense of peace, maybe, or belonging. He hadn't thought about those summers in years, not until now, standing here in the barn with the storm raging outside and a horse staring at him like it could see straight through his soul. He pushed off the post and took another step toward the stall. The horse shifted slightly, its hooves scraping against the dirt floor, but it didn't back away this time. He reached out slowly, his hand trembling just a little, and let it hover near the horse's neck. The animal sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring, and then, to his surprise, it lowered its head just enough for him to make contact. His hand brushed against its coarse coat, and a strange warmth spread through him, a small flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. The moment didn't last long. The horse snorted and pulled away, retreating to the far corner of the stall. He let his hand drop and stepped back, giving the animal space. He didn't blame it for being skittish. It had been alone for who knows how long, abandoned and forgotten. In some ways, it reminded him of himself. That thought stayed with him as he made his way back to the small house on the edge of the property. It wasn't much, a single-story structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Inside, the air was cold and stale, the kind of emptiness that seeped into your bones if you stayed too long. He lit the old wood stove in the corner and sat down at the kitchen table, staring out the window as the rain streaked the glass. The horse was a problem he couldn't ignore. He didn't know where to start, but he knew he couldn't leave it in that state. He'd need to clean out the stall, find some proper feed, maybe call a vet to check on its health. The thought of all that work was overwhelming, but there was also a small part of him quiet and almost imperceptible that felt something close to purpose. It was strange, the way that animal had looked at him, like it was waiting for him to do something, to prove something. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and the ground slick with mud. He pulled on an old jacket and headed back to the barn, stopping briefly at the feed shed to see what was inside. Most of the supplies were outdated or unusable, but he managed to find a few bales of hay that hadn't completely rotted and a rusty bucket he could use for water. The horse was in the same spot he'd left it, standing quietly in the stall. It watched him as he worked, its eyes following his every move. He cleaned out the old, damp straw and replaced it with fresh hay. Then filled the bucket with water from the pump outside. The tasks were simple, almost mindless, but they kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering too far into the darker corners of his thoughts. As the days passed, a routine began to form. He'd wake up early, make his way to the barn, and tend to the horse. At first, it kept its distance, watching him warily from the far side of the stall. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to inch closer. By the end of the week, it was eating from his hand, its soft muzzle brushing against his palm. He found himself talking to the horse as he worked, his words filling the silence that had once felt so suffocating. He told it about his uncle, about the summers he'd spent here as a boy, about the mistakes he'd made and the life he'd lost. The horse, of course, didn't respond, but it listened in its own way, its dark eyes never leaving his face. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned shades of orange and pink, he sat on the edge of the stall and watched the horse grazing on the fresh hay. He still didn't know what he was doing, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely lost. There was still a heaviness in his chest, a weight that wouldn't let him forget the things he'd done and the people he'd hurt. But there was also something else now, something small and fragile but unmistakable. Hope. It was a strange feeling, foreign and unfamiliar, but it was there, flickering like a candle in the darkness. And as he sat there, listening to the quiet sounds of the barn and the soft rustling of the horse's movements, he realized something. He hadn't saved the horse, it was saving him. But the story wasn't over. There was still so much he didn't know, so much he hadn't yet faced. And as the last light of the day faded and the barn was plunged into shadow, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. As the days passed, the bond between the man and the horse grew stronger, though both remained haunted by unspoken truths. The barn, once a place of dread, had become their shared sanctuary, the only space where the man felt the weight of his past slip just slightly off his shoulders. The horse, still unnamed, still a ghost of its former self, was no longer the creature he'd first encountered, wild-eyed and trembling. It had softened in the quiet routine they'd established, though the shadows in its eyes never fully faded. It was as if both of them were trying, in their own way, to heal, yet neither truly understood what that meant. The man found himself spending more and more time with the horse, working through his own struggles in the silence of the barn. But there was something else there, something lurking just beneath the surface of the tranquility they had built. It wasn't just the echoes of his past that kept him up at night, it was the gnawing feeling that he was being watched. It started small, subtle, a flicker of movement out of the corner of his eye, a strange sense of unease when he was alone in the barn. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him, the result of too many sleepless nights and the weight of guilt pressing against his chest. But the feeling grew more persistent with each passing day. He'd catch glimpses of someone watching him from the edge of the field, a shadow moving swiftly in the distance, vanishing before he could make sense of it. One evening, as the sun sank low and the sky turned a deep, bruised purple, he decided to confront the feeling. He'd had enough of hiding from whatever or whoever was out there. The barn felt suffocating, and his thoughts were starting to spiral again, the old, familiar patterns creeping back in. He grabbed a flashlight and a coat, stepping outside into the cooling air. The wind had died down, leaving behind a strange stillness. He scanned the field with the beam of the flashlight, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, he thought it was just a trick of the light, a bush swaying in the wind, an animal moving through the grass, but then, there it was. A figure, standing still at the far edge of the field, just inside the tree line. His breath caught in his throat. It was too far away to make out any details, but the shape was unmistakable. A person. The man's instincts told him to stay put, to retreat back into the barn and lock the door behind him. But something inside him refused to let him run. He wasn't sure if it was the raw loneliness that had consumed him in recent months, or if it was the strange compulsion to face whatever or whoever had been watching him, but he found himself walking toward the figure. With each step he took, the figure remained motionless, its outline growing clearer in the dim light. He reached the edge of the field, where the grass met the trees, and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The figure didn't respond, didn't even move. It stood in eerie silence, watching him. His heart raced, but his feet remained rooted to the ground. What did he think he'd do if he got close? What was he expecting? Finally, the figure stirred, taking a slow step forward. The man's breath caught in his throat, but he stood his ground. As the figure drew closer, he could make out the details: an older man, weathered by time and life, his clothes ragged and torn as though he'd been living rough. The stranger stopped a few feet away, his face hidden in the shadows of the trees. The man opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. There was something about the stranger's presence that made him hesitate. "I didn't mean to intrude," the man said, his voice rough, as if he'd forgotten how to speak to another person. "Who are you?" The stranger didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, weathered notebook. He flipped it open, revealing pages filled with scribbled words, diagrams, and strange symbols. The man squinted, unsure of what he was looking at. The stranger's finger traced a line on the page, and then he looked up, meeting the man's gaze for the first time. "You've found it," the stranger said, his voice low and gravelly. "The one who's been waiting for you." The man blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" The stranger's eyes flicked toward the barn, where the horse was now visible in the dim light, standing at the door, its gaze fixed on them. "It's not just a horse," the stranger muttered. "It's something else. And it's not here by accident." The man felt a chill run down his spine, a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. "What do you mean?" The stranger's lips curled into a faint smile, though there was no warmth in it. "That horse has been sent to you. And you've been sent to it." The man stepped back, a wave of unease crashing over him. "I don't understand. What's happening here?" The stranger didn't answer. He simply turned and began to walk away, his movements slow but purposeful, as if he knew exactly where he was going. "You'll figure it out," he called over his shoulder, his voice barely audible in the wind. "In time, you'll understand what's coming. But don't wait too long. You don't have much time left." The man stood frozen for a moment, watching the stranger disappear into the trees. The world felt smaller now, as if something had shifted in the air, and the tension that had been building over the past few weeks had finally come to a head. He turned back toward barn, his mind racing with questions. What had the stranger meant? And why had he said the horse was sent to him? The horse, still standing by the door, let out a soft whinny, as if acknowledging his presence. The man took a step toward it, feeling the familiar sense of calm wash over him despite the chaos swirling inside his head. He didn't have all the answers, not yet, but he knew one thing for sure: the horse wasn't just a symbol of what he had lost. It was a key to something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. And whatever that something was, it was coming for him. He didn't know what would happen next. But he knew he had to face it, no matter how terrifying it might be. The days that followed felt heavier than before. The strange encounter with the older man had left him unsettled, his mind swirling with unanswered questions. The horse, as if sensing the tension, had become even more watchful, its dark eyes following the man's every move. It was no longer the docile creature he had started to care for. Now, it seemed to carry a sense of urgency, a strange awareness, as though it too could feel the weight of whatever was coming. The man spent more time in the barn, trying to ignore the whispers of the wind outside, the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer and darker as night fell. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for him to make a move. The days blurred together, each one feeling like the last, and the only sense of clarity he had came when he was with the horse. Its presence grounded him, offered him some semblance of peace amidst the chaos in his mind. But then, as the moon reached its peak one night, everything shifted. The air grew thick, charged with an electric tension that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It started with a low rumble, like distant thunder, but there was no storm in sight. The ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble, just slightly, and the barn creaked in protest as if it was alive. The man's heart raced. The feeling he had been dreading was finally settling in a sense of impending doom, as if something was about to break through the thin veil of normalcy that had surrounded him. He rushed to the barn, his pulse quickening with every step. The horse was agitated, stomping its hooves and pacing back and forth. It whinnied loudly, a sound that echoed off the walls and sent a shiver through him. Something was wrong. Something was coming. As he entered the barn, he saw it. The air around the horse seemed to ripple, warping the space like a mirage. The horse's eyes, which had always been so dark, were glowing faintly now, an eerie light that seemed to pulse with every beat of its heart. The man froze, unable to move, as the barn seemed to close in around him. The shadows shifted unnaturally, twisting and stretching toward him as if reaching for him, pulling at the edges of his vision. The world felt out of place, like he was standing on the edge of a nightmare that hadn't yet fully revealed itself. Then, without warning, the barn doors slammed shut with a deafening bang. He spun around, heart racing, but the air felt thick, almost suffocating, and the door wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him. He tried to force it open, but the wood wouldn't yield, the walls seeming to press in on him. The horse was no longer pacing. It stood perfectly still, its glowing eyes fixed on him, and the ground beneath his feet began to tremble once more. He stepped back, a sense of terror rising in his chest, as the temperature in the barn dropped sharply. He could see his breath in front of him now, the chill settling into his bones. It was as if the very air had turned to ice. The man's hands shook as he reached for the flashlight in his pocket, but the beam of light flickered and sputtered, leaving only darkness in its wake. Desperation set in, and he shouted, pounding on the walls and calling out, but his voice was swallowed by the eerie silence that had settled over the barn. And then he heard it, a whisper, low and unmistakable, though it didn't come from any person. The voice was soft, yet insistent, like a warning carried on the wind. "You weren't meant to be here." The words sent a chill down his spine. He spun around, but there was no one there. The barn was empty, save for the horse, whose glowing eyes never left him. The voice, if it could even be called that, seemed to echo in his mind rather than in the air, leaving him with a feeling of deep dread. This wasn't just a horse. It wasn't just an animal in need of care. It was something else entirely, something far older, and far more powerful than he had ever imagined. The ground beneath him shifted again, and he stumbled, his knees buckling as he tried to keep his balance. The barn walls seemed to stretch and breathe, pulsing with the same rhythm as the horse's glowing eyes. It was as if the barn itself had come alive, reacting to something, or someone, that was beyond him. The horse let out a loud, eerie whinny, and the man's blood ran cold. This was no longer about healing. This was no longer about the horse or his past. Whatever had drawn him here was beginning to reveal itself, and he wasn't sure if he was prepared for what came next. He turned to the door again, frantic now, trying to find any way out, but then the ground cracked beneath him. A deep, reverberating crack that seemed to shake the very foundation of the barn. The man fell to the floor, his hands splayed out to catch himself as the walls groaned in protest. The horse's glowing eyes locked onto him, unblinking. The whispering voice grew louder, filling his mind with a sense of doom he couldn't escape. "You're not meant to leave." The world around him began to spin, the barn warping and shifting as though it was alive. The temperature dropped even further, and the light from the glowing eyes seemed to grow brighter, blinding him as he staggered to his feet. He had to escape. He had to leave before whatever was coming could catch him, but the door remained shut. The ground trembled again, this time violently, and a loud crash sounded from outside, like something had fallen. The silence that followed was suffocating. In that moment, the man realized that everything he had been running from, everything he had been avoiding, had led him here, to this barn, to this horse. It was no longer just a chance encounter, no longer a forgotten piece of his uncle's life. It was a reckoning. A force of nature that was beyond his understanding. But what was it? And why had it come for him? The voice in his head spoke again, the words now in urgent command. "You must decide. You must choose." He closed his eyes, trying to block out the chaos around him, the trembling ground, the whispering voice, and the glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through him. He had no idea what he was supposed to choose, or how he was supposed to survive whatever was happening. The only thing he knew was that he couldn't stay here much longer. The barn was closing in, and the darkness was swallowing him whole. But as he looked at the horse one last time, something changed. The glowing eyes softened, just for a moment, and the man could have sworn he saw something more in them, something familiar, something human. And in that fleeting instant, he understood. The horse wasn't just an animal. It was a guide. A link between the living and the dead. And it was waiting for him to make a choice. But as the voice in his head grew louder, so did the storm outside. The wind howled, the walls of the barn shook, and the man knew that the time to choose was fast approaching. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for what would come after. The air inside the barn grew even heavier, the pulse of the horse's glowing eyes now synchronized with the thunderous rhythm of his heartbeat. Every inch of the barn seemed to tremble, as though it, too, was awaiting the choice he had yet to make. He could hear the wind howling outside, a gust rattling the windows, but nothing could drown out the voice in his head, the whisper that had become louder, more insistent. Choose or be chosen. His stomach churned with fear, his mind spinning, trying to make sense of everything that had led him here. The horse's presence was undeniable now, like a force of nature that had always been meant for him. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that whatever was happening was far beyond his control. The horse wasn't simply an animal. It wasn't just a guide. It was a key to something ancient, something powerful, and the man could feel its weight pressing down on him. He staggered backward, his legs weak, his breath shallow. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the barn almost alive, as if it were suffocating him with its presence. His eyes darted toward the door, but it was no use. No matter how hard he tried, the door wouldn't budge, and every attempt to force it open felt like fighting against a solid wall of stone. Then, as if on cue, the barn doors shook violently, the wood creaking under some invisible pressure. He froze, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. There was no way out. He was trapped. And that's when it happened. A low rumble echoed through the ground beneath his feet, and a crack appeared in the barn's floor, sharp and jagged like a wound in the earth itself. He stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. From the crack, something began to emerge, something dark, something alive, something wrong. At first, he thought it was just the shadows, stretching and contorting in unnatural shapes. But then it became clearer, a dark, shadowy figure, crawling up from the earth itself, its form impossible to make out in the dim light. It moved with an eerie slowness, as if testing the air, tasting the atmosphere, like it had been waiting for something. Or someone. The man's eyes widened in horror as the figure grew larger, its form solidifying into something monstrous and ancient being, its body composed of swirling darkness, its eyes glowing with an unnatural red hue. It was like nothing he had ever seen, an entity of pure malice, its presence suffocating very air around him. The horse, standing motionless in the corner of the barn, let out a low, guttural sound, a kind of warning. But the man didn't need the warning. He could feel the malevolent energy of the creature, its intent clear in the way it glided toward him, its presence oppressive, like a storm about to break. The ground beneath him quaked as the creature moved forward, the shadows lengthening and warping around it, making it seem as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling. His heart raced as he realized the truth: this wasn't just some hallucination or nightmare. This creature had always been here, lurking just beneath the surface, and now, for the first time, it had come to life. The voice in his head returned, now booming, a force that rattled his bones. It has come. The one who will choose or fall. The man's breath caught in his throat as he turned his gaze back to the horse. For the first time, he understood. The horse wasn't just waiting for him to make a choice. It was part of this. It was tied to whatever force had unleashed this creature. The horse's glowing eyes weren't just watching him, they were guiding him, trying to warn him. But the choice was never his to make. The creature's eyes locked onto him, and a bone-chilling laugh echoed through the barn, reverberating in his chest. It was the sound of a being that had existed for eons, a creature that had been waiting for this exact moment. It had sensed something within him, something that had drawn it here, and now it was here to claim him. The man's knees buckled as terror surged through him. He reached for the horse, his only hope, but the creature moved faster than he could react, its form shifting and twisting in air. The barn trembled again, and the darkness seemed to grow thicker, more suffocating. In that moment, everything in him screamed to run. But there was nowhere to go. The walls of the barn were closing in, and the ground itself felt like it was about to swallow him whole. He could hear the whispers again, louder now, but they weren't just in his head. The voice had become a chorus, an ancient chant that seemed to come from every direction, from the very earth beneath him. You are the chosen one. The one who will bring forth the end. But before he could even process what it meant, the horse moved. It wasn't the calm, gentle animal he had known. The glowing eyes flared with a new intensity, and the horse's body seemed to glow, pulsing with energy, as if it was no longer just a creature of flesh and bone. It was becoming something more, something far beyond what he could comprehend. Its hooves struck the ground, creating sparks that lit up the barn, and it charged toward the dark creature with an unearthly speed. The man stood frozen, his mind racing to catch up with what he was seeing. The horse, his guide, his only companion, was attacking the creature. But why? What had happened? And what did this all mean? The clash of forces shook the barn to its core. The shadows that clung to the creature's form twisted violently, fighting against the horse's light. The man couldn't look away, even as the walls of the barn shook with a force he had never felt before. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew this was moment. The moment where everything would either end or change forever. The horse and the creature fought with a fury that rattled the very earth beneath his feet. The light from the horse's eyes burned brighter, pushing back the darkness, but the creature wasn't done yet. It twisted and shifted, its form becoming more monstrous, more dangerous with every passing second. The barn was falling apart, and the man was caught between two forces he couldn't begin to understand. In the midst of it all, he realized with growing dread that the creature wasn't just after him. It was after the horse. And if it succeeded in defeating horse, there would be nothing left to stop it from unleashing the darkness that had been waiting for centuries. And just as the struggle reached its peak, a final, terrible scream pierced the air louder than any noise he had ever heard before. It was the scream of something that knew it was about to win. The man's world spun into chaos. Everything was falling apart, and the stakes had never been higher. Yet, as the battle raged on, he knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same. The barn shook violently, the entire structure groaning under the weight of the battle between the horse and the dark creature. The man stood frozen, unable to comprehend the sheer force of their struggle. It was as if the fabric of reality itself was being torn apart. The horse, glowing brighter than ever, struck with unyielding power, its hooves making contact with the dark creature with a force that sent shockwaves through the air. But the creature wasn't yielding. It twisted and writhed, its form growing larger, more menacing, as though it was feeding off the very darkness it had brought into the world. In that moment, the man knew there was only one way to end this. He had to act, had to find a way to tip the balance before the creature consumed everything. The voice in his head had warned him, "You are the chosen one. You must decide." But now, he understood. He wasn't the chosen one to bring about destruction. He was one who could stop it. His eyes snapped to the horse. The glowing light from its body flickered, threatening to dim as the creature's shadowy form surged forward. The man's heart raced. The horse was losing. It couldn't keep this up for much longer. Suddenly, a realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. The horse wasn't just fighting the creature, it was the last barrier between the creature and the world outside. The darkness was looking for something. No, someone. And the horse was its protector, guarding whatever it was from the clutches of this ancient, malevolent force. Without thinking, the man rushed forward, his breath ragged, his heart hammering in his chest. The creature hissed as it noticed his movement, its glowing eyes narrowing, a deep, guttural growl rising from its throat. It was as if it knew the man had finally understood, and it was ready to stop him at any cost. The man reached the horse, his hands shaking as he placed them on its warm, trembling body. He could feel the pulse of its energy, the light that was beginning to fade as the creature's influence grew stronger. The bond between them was undeniable, something far greater than mere coincidence. The horse was more than an animal, it was a force of nature. And if he didn't do something now, it would be too late. He leaned in close, whispering to horse, not knowing if it could understand him, but knowing he had to try. "Please help me. Help us both." As his words left his lips, something changed. The air around them seemed to crackle with power, a wave of energy rushing through the man's body. He could feel it, that connection, something ancient awakening within him. The horse let out a deep, resonant whinny, its eyes glowing brighter than ever. The creature recoiled for a moment, its shadowy form faltering as if caught off guard by the sudden surge of energy. And then, the unexpected happened. The horse's glowing eyes flared one final time, brighter than the sun itself. A shockwave of light erupted from its body, sending the creature stumbling backward. The man shielded his eyes as the light enveloped him, filling him with an overwhelming sense of power and clarity. For a brief moment, he understood everything: the horse, the creature, the bond between them all. This wasn't just about choice. This was about balance. The horse wasn't simply guarding the world from the darkness, it was holding it at bay, keeping the world safe from an ancient force that had been waiting to escape. The creature roared in fury, but its power was no match for the horse's light. It writhed and twisted, its form disintegrating as the light washed over it. The barn trembled one last time, the darkness fighting to hold on, but the horse's energy surged with a final, blinding burst, and the creature vanished, swallowed by the light. The silence that followed was deafening. The barn, once trembling with the clash of forces, was now still. The walls stopped groaning, the shadows receded, and the air grew warm again. The man blinked, his eyes adjusting to the sudden calm. The horse, its glow now dimming, stood beside him, its eyes no longer glowing with unnatural light. It was just a horse again. But something had changed. The tension that had gripped the air was gone, replaced by a strange peace. But just as he began to let out a breath of relief, a new sound reached his ears, a soft whisper, barely audible, coming from the floor beneath him. His heart skipped a beat as he glanced down, his stomach tightening. The crack in the ground that had formed earlier began to glow with a faint light, different from the light of the horse. It pulsed slowly, rhythmically, as if something deep beneath the earth was waking up. The man stepped back, his mind racing. The creature may have been defeated, but he realized with growing dread that whatever force had been contained for so long wasn't gone. It was just waiting. Suddenly, the ground beneath him cracked open wider, the faint glow intensifying. The whispering grew louder, becoming words, though he couldn't understand them. The voice seemed familiar, the same one that had spoken to him earlier, but now it sounded different. As though it was no longer just a whisper in his mind, but something far more tangible. And then, just as he thought he could take no more, the final twist came. The horse, once a beacon of light, turned toward him. Its eyes locked onto his, and in that brief, silent moment, the man realized something that made his blood run cold. The horse wasn't just a guide. It wasn't just a protector. It had always known what was coming. And now, in the silence that followed, he understood. The horse had been preparing him. Preparing him for what was to come next. Because the horse wasn't the answer. It was key. And as the crack in the earth widened, the man's heart sank, knowing that the choice he had made had only been the beginning. The real test was yet to come. The barn was a maelstrom of sound and fury. The creature, now an impossible swirl of shadows and darkness, shrieked in defiance as it fought against the horse's glowing force. The air itself felt alive, charged with raw energy, and the man could barely stand, his legs shaking with the weight of everything he had witnessed. The walls of the barn trembled with power of their clash, cracks spreading across floor like a spreading fire. The horse, its form more radiant than ever, seemed to hold its own. The glow from its eyes blazed, its hooves pounding earth with a force that echoed like thunder. The creature's movements were erratic now, as if it was losing control, its form twisting and warping in response to the horse's power. The air grew hotter, the temperature rising to an almost unbearable level, as if barn itself was caught in heat of their battle. The man's heart pounded in his chest, fear and awe mixing in his veins. He couldn't tear his eyes away. The creature, with its glowing red eyes and mass of shifting shadows, was terrifying. Yet the horse, his guide, stood firm, its strength unyielding. It was as if horse was protecting him, keeping him safe from darkness that threatened to swallow everything. The barn's wooden beams creaked in protest, some snapping under the pressure of the supernatural forces at play. The roof groaned, threatening to cave in, and dust rained down from the rafters. The ground cracked wide open, the fissures stretching out like veins in earth, the barn sinking slowly, as though the battle was tearing apart reality itself. Just as the horse and the creature collided in a final, explosive clash, the barn went completely still. Silence descended like a heavy curtain. The man stood motionless, barely daring to breathe. The glow from the horse's eyes dimmed, and the creature's form seemed to lose its definition, its movements sluggish, almost defeated. The creature let out a sound, almost a whimper, a low moan as the light from the horse enveloped it. The shadows melted away, vanishing like mist in the sun, and the figure that had once been so terrifying shrank into nothingness. A final pulse of light from the horse shattered the remaining darkness, and then all was quiet. The man stood, frozen, his mind racing. Had it ended? Was it really over? He looked around, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The barn was still intact, though the damage from the battle was evident. The ground had calmed, the tremors gone, but the air still felt thick, as though the very fabric of the world had been stretched too far. The horse stood before him, no longer glowing, but its eyes still held an intensity that made the man's breath catch in his throat. It was as if the horse knew everything now. It had done what it was meant to do. It had protected him, and in doing so, it had stopped whatever ancient force had tried to consume them both. The man took a tentative step forward. His heart still raced, his body trembling from the fear that had surged through him moments before. The barn, despite the destruction, felt safe now. There was no more darkness, no more creature to fear. And yet, something still lingered. A sense of unfinished business. The horse lowered its head, its glowing eyes softening for the first time since he had met it. The man approached slowly, drawn by some inexplicable force, as if the horse was calling him. He reached out, his hand trembling, and brushed his fingers against the horse's muzzle. It was warm, almost alive, and as his hand touched its skin, a rush of memories flooded his mind. Images flashed before him, visions of a time long past, of people and places he couldn't recognize, of battles fought and won, of ancient pacts made with creatures not of this world. The horse had always been more than it seemed. It was a keeper of balance, a guardian against the forces that sought to tear apart the world. The man wasn't just a random bystander in this battle. He had been chosen, not by the horse, but by fate itself. The horse's eyes met his once more, and in that moment, the man understood. He had been drawn here, to this place, not to escape his past, but to confront it. To confront the darkness that had been following him for so long. It was never just about the horse or the barn. It was about him. About his role in the greater scheme of things, about the choices he had made and the ones still to come. A cold gust of wind blew through the barn, and the man shivered. The silence that followed felt oppressive, as if something was waiting for him to make the next move. He glanced at the horse once more, its gaze steady and unwavering. It was as though the horse was telling him that his journey was not yet over. And then, the ground beneath him shifted again, but this time it wasn't the tremor of battle. It was a pull, gentle but persistent, drawing him towards something unseen. The man took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his decision settle in his chest. The barn around him seemed to fade, the edges of the world growing blurry, and he knew that whatever lay ahead, it would be just the beginning. The horse turned and walked slowly toward the barn's open door, its tail swishing gently behind it. Without a word, the man followed. He knew there was no turning back now, not after everything he had witnessed, everything he had learned. His life would never be the same. He wasn't just a man who had once been broken. He was something more. He was a part of something much larger than himself. As he stepped into the night, the moonlight casting long shadows on the ground, the horse stopped and turned to face him. The two stood there, the world quiet around them, and for the first time, the man felt a sense of peace. He had made it through the darkness, and whatever came next, he was ready. The road ahead was unknown, filled with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear, he wasn't walking it alone. And as the wind whispered through the trees, he knew that the horse would guide him, not just through the world, but through himself, teaching him lessons he had yet to understand. The man took a deep breath, his heart still pounding, but now with anticipation. The night was alive with possibility. And for the first time in a long while, he was ready to face it. The barn, the creature, and the trials of the past were now behind him. But he knew deep down that the real journey was just beginning. And somewhere in the distance, a faint sound carried on the wind a whisper, soft and almost imperceptible. "The path is yours to walk now." The man smiled softly, his eyes meeting the horse's for one final moment. Whatever the future held, he knew he had found his purpose. And with that, they both walked into the unknown together, the first steps of a new chapter in a story that had only just begun.